Good evening. We're fortunate to have as our visiting Phi Beta Kappa scholar this year, Professor Harvey Brooks. Professor Brooks' educational background includes a Bachelor of Arts from Yale, a fellowship at Cambridge University, and a PhD in physics from Harvard in 1940, followed by membership in the Society of Fellows at Harvard. During the war, Professor Brooks worked in both research and administrative capacities with various laboratories, including the Knowles Atomic Power Laboratory of the Atomic Energy Commission. In 1950, he returned to Harvard, where he was successively Professor of Applied Physics. Well, it's on. Now it's not. Now? No. Now? Now is it on? No. Okay, it was working earlier. Well, I'll go on with the introduction. I'll try to speak a little louder. I don't know whether they'll ever get it fixed or not. In 1950, Professor Brooks returned to Harvard, where he was successively Professor of Applied Physics, Dean of Engineering and Applied Physics, and he's now Professor of Technology and Public Policy, and he teaches in the Kemeny School of Government. Professor Brooks has served the U.S. government in many advisory capacities during both the Kennedy and the Johnson administrations. He is currently chairman of the Commission on Socio-Technical Systems of the National Research Council, and he's co-chairman of the NAS-NRC study on the future role of nuclear energy in the context of alternative energy systems. Professor Brooks is a member of many societies, including the American Physical Society, the American Philosophical Society, the American Academy of Science, of which he was president from 1971 to 1975, the National Academy of Science, Sigma Xi, and of course, Phi Beta Kappa. He has received numerous fellowships, awards, and honorary degrees. His title of his talk this evening is very appropriate: Science and Technology, Hope or Catastrophe. Professor Brooks.
It works. Gerald Holton has divided attitudes towards the human future into two categories. There are the pessimists who believe that the salvation of the world is impossible because of the depredations of science and technology, and the optimists who believe that the salvation of the world is inevitable because science and technology will ride in to rescue us in the nick of time. Until recently, most scientists were squarely and almost automatically in the optimist camp. The pessimists were to be found almost exclusively among humanists. C.P. Snow invented the phrase "the two cultures" to identify what he saw as the profound cultural and temperamental gap separating scientists from the rest of high culture. Only the scientists had the future in their bones, he asserted, and by implication, scientists embodied most hopes for a better human future. In the last decade, the pessimists have acquired some recruits among leading scientists, and to a much lesser degree among engineers. Even among the great majority of scientists who remain in the optimist camp, the position has receded to the point of view that the salvation of the world is possible but not inevitable. The inevitability of progress is now treated as a Victorian anachronism, even by scientists. There are differences among disciplines, of course. Pessimism is most prevalent in the field of ecology, which became intellectually respectable on the strength of it. The diffusion of pessimism among intellectuals accompanied the popularization of the science of ecology. More recently, pessimism has spread more widely among the biological disciplines, especially in the most successful one, molecular biology, and has been accompanied by questioning of the desirability of further advances. It has also become fashionable in the behavioral sciences, especially those most concerned with the hidden springs of individual and social behavior. The optimist camp is clearly headed by the economists, who, among all intellectuals, retain the greatest pristine faith in the powers of science and technology, much more than the natural scientists themselves. Having neglected technology ever since Marx, the economists 2 decades ago re-identified technology as the engine of growth and social progress. Physicists sit more on the fence, with younger physicists being more pessimistic than their older peers. Probably this is partly the outcome of the close involvement of physics and many of the leaders of physics in military technology and nuclear weapons. And it is a kind of intellectual penance for the post-war euphoria about the potential benefits of physics to mankind. It is probably no accident that the most emphatic scientific expressions of the pessimist viewpoint come from representatives of the two disciplines which are the most holistic in their approach, ecology and systems analysis. However, most ecologists are pessimists, while both the most uncritical proponents of scientific optimism and the greatest pessimists are to be found among the systems analysts. Both these disciplines are concerned with complex systems in which everything is connected to everything else, and they focus on the connections rather than the parts. The ecologists take the position that things are so complicated that one can never be confident of the effects of any human intervention in an ecosystem. The better one understands the system, the more likely is one to find that an intervention is ultimately bad, no matter how beneficial it may seem at first. Hence, technology, as one of the most important forms of intervention, should be deemed deleterious until proved otherwise by searching research and analysis. The view of the pessimist school of systems analysts is typified by the systems dynamics school of Jay Forrester and his disciples at MIT. In contrast with the ecologists, their pessimism seems to arise more from confidence in their methodology than from caution in the face of complexity and uncertainty. The pessimistic behavioral scientists are those used to dealing with complex social systems and with the limited rationality of social and political behavior. Thus, they are skeptical of the ability of social and political institutions to cope with the increasing burden of choices brought about by the applications of science and technology. In their view, technological change, no matter how beneficially intended, overloads social systems and thereby produces more unintended than intended consequences. Moreover, the politics of management of complex technologies tends to undermine the presumed technical rationality of such systems, producing an ever-widening gap between technical plans and their implementation in the real world. For example, the most sophisticated school of critics of nuclear power now concedes that it can be made safe technically, but argues that you cannot count on real human institutions and people to execute the designs and to follow the specified operational procedures. One of the most dramatic statements of the ecological perspective came from a manifesto of 30 British scientists issued in 1972 under the title Blueprint for Survival. This group called for an immediate cessation of economic growth. 50 more scientists endorsed their report in a letter to the London Times, claiming that, and I quote, "If current trends are allowed to persist, the breakdown of society and the irreversible disruption of the life support system on this planet, possibly by the end of the century, certainly within the lifetime of our children, are inevitable," end of quote. These dire predictions were supported with seeming scientific precision by the computer models World 2 and World 3 developed by Forrester and Meadows under the sponsorship of the International Club of Rome, which ensured a wide public audience. One typical humanist perspective is perhaps the draft of a statement from the World Council of Churches on global problems, which opened with the following words, and I quote, "However robust the faith of yesterday in the power of science and technology is today misplaced and therefore misleading. In fact, the reductionist, triumphalist manipulative approach of science and technology has itself been in large part responsible for our predicament, end of quote. So much for the pristine faith of the economists. Other important currents must be mentioned on the pessimistic side of this debate. In the cases I've just cited, oncoming catastrophe is attributed to the application of scientific technology. Many regard this catastrophe as the inevitable consequence of the underlying premises and attitudes of the scientific revolution of 300 years ago. There are others, however, who attribute our problems not to science itself, but to its embodiment in a particular kind of technology, high technology, which is equated to large-scale centralized technology operated and controlled by large impersonal bureaucracies, both corporate and governmental. These bureaucracies are said to be dominated by experts who are not politically accountable to the people their decisions affect. To a remarkable degree, nuclear power has become the devil symbol for this group, the epitome of everything they deplore about modern scientific technology. This school of critics of science and technology nevertheless asserts the possibility of an alternative but equally sophisticated and scientific low technology or soft technology which emphasizes decentralization, local self-sufficiency, and small-scale enterprise controlled by consumers and craftsmen. They look forward to a society of the future in which, once again, as in the mid-19th century America, most of the population is self-employed rather than working in large organizations. Solar energy, windmills, and renewable resources have become the positive symbols for this group. In a sense, they seem to have transferred an aspect of the ecological model of nature to human societies. The society they envision is harmonious and self-regulating, like an idealized ecosystem, and incorporates some of the ideology of a classical free enterprise, although their attitude towards individual choice and freedom seems ambiguous. The Bible of this group is a book, Small is Beautiful, written by a German-born British economist, E.F. Schumacher. This viewpoint seems to overlook that in real life, ecosystems which are macroscopically harmonious are very tough on individuals. This latter school of thought is hard to classify unequivocally as either optimists or pessimists. While they take ecological doom seriously, they believe it can be averted through appropriate science and technology, but only in a context of a radical change of social values and social structure, which harks back to the America of Jefferson, a world of small farmers and entrepreneurs living in small, largely self-sufficient communities and working with tools provided by democratically managed science and technology. It is indeed an appealing picture, consonant with the American preference for rural over urban values. While many sympathize with it as an alternative lifestyle which should be available to small groups in an affluent society, and certainly as something perhaps appropriate for underdeveloped countries, few believe it to be a realistic goal for the great majority of citizens in the developed countries. Though much of the post-World War II Through much of the post-World War II era, scientists have justified government support of basic research on the grounds that it was the indispensable substratum of technological innovation, which was itself taken to be an almost automatic and intrinsically good consequence of science. Now science, to an extent, finds itself hoist on its own petard, held responsible for the evils of technology regarded as grown out of control, a blind monster advancing according to its own inexorable internal logic without democratic accountability. The appropriate technology movement, popularized by Schumacher, may perhaps be interpreted as an effort of basic science to dissociate itself from recent trends in technology and to present an alternative image of society equally based on science. This group is opposed both to modern socialism and to modern capitalism and seems to look to its model more to the sayings of Chairman Mao, though in an image of Mao's China which bears little resemblance to the reality portrayed by Western economists who have actually studied the Chinese economy. There are, of course, understandable reasons behind the modern revolt of intellectuals against science and technology. This revolt, incidentally, is not new. It arises almost once in a generation and has from the earliest days of the Industrial Revolution. Largely confined to the educated class, it is much more important today than in the past because the well-educated represent a much larger and more rapidly growing fraction of the population than ever before. All of post-war science and technology stands in the shadow of the most intense application of theoretical knowledge to the arts of war in the history of man, a time in which worldwide 1 scientist or engineer in 4 is employed in military research or development. And above all this sits the ominous image of the mushroom cloud. None of this can be simply wished away as the abuse of science by society, since respected leaders of science have played a far from passive role in selling these dangerous toys to receptive politicians and bureaucrats. It was none other than the most humane and kindly of men, Albert Einstein, who helped sell President Roosevelt on the Manhattan Project in World War II. And as Herbert York has demonstrated in several books and articles, little of the weapons revolution of the past 3 decades would have occurred without the active initiative and even political salesmanship of prestigious and respected scientists, acting out of what they sincerely believed at the time to be the most worthy and constructive of motives. Of course, like others, they were captives of the general political climate of their times, and their views, as in other cases, may have contained a component of rationalization of personal ambition. Science has also been blamed for environmental degradation, largely because it is the base of so much of technology. Yet, ironically enough, much of what has become such a source of alarm today would never have been suspected without the instruments and techniques provided by science. The famous Los Angeles smog was attributed to backyard incinerators, and until in the early 1950s, a Caltech chemist, Hagenschmidt, proposed a complicated theory for the catalytic formation of smog by the action of sunlight on the invisible and unsmellable constituents of automobile exhausts, and was able to prove his hypothesis in the laboratory. Unlike the belching smokestacks of the 19th century, today's pollution consists mostly of substances undetectable by the human senses. What is detectable is usually the product of complex secondary chemical or biological processes acting on the primary effluents to produce new substances, processes that we would not have even whose existence we would not have even suspected without the increase in scientific understanding. Thus, invisible auto exhausts produce smog. Invisible sulfur dioxide emissions from power plants interact with subvisible smoke particles to produce hazardous sulfate aerosols. Innocuous phosphates dissolved in water serve as nutrients for the growth of algae, which die and are decomposed by bacteria to form stinking watercourses and eutrophied lakes. Invisible carbon dioxide from the burning of fossil fuels is the source of future climatic changes, which can only be understood or predicted by sophisticated computer models of the atmosphere. Little of the pollution which causes us such concern today would have produced health or environmental effects which would have been detectable by our ancestors, beset as they were by infectious diseases borne by drinking water, contaminated drinking water, and in other ways. Perhaps the most striking example of the subtlety of the modern type of pollution is the current theory of the effects of fluorocarbons on stratospheric ozone, or even the more subtle and speculative theory of the effects of nitrogen fertilizers and combustion products on the ozone layer, which shields us from the sun's ultraviolet radiation. These global effects could never incidentally be detected by unaided human experience. Without the stimulus of an ingenious scientific hypothesis, nobody would have even thought to look for the effect with instruments or by epidemiological studies. The effects in question are masked by too many background fluctuations, which are larger, though more localized in space and time. One of the difficulties is that we are talking of human impacts which lie many decades in the future from the time that the causative activities are occurring. Many other pollutants which concern us today have similar built-in time delays in their human effects, so that we have to be able to predict them scientifically many years in advance in order to install them. For example, carcinogens, that is to say cancer-producing substances in air, water, or food, if ingested today, may not produce cancer for 30 or 40 years. The same is true of low levels of radiation. If we wait to detect effects through the careful observation of health statistics, the potential future effect for a future effect may have accumulated to dangerous proportions and will be reversible only after many years. Should we then blame science for making possible a technology which causes these insidious effects, albeit usually with accompanying immediate and desired social and economic benefits, such as personal mobility and the abolition of hard physical labor, or should we praise science for being able to warn us of these effects before there is serious potential damage? In this sense, we can say that science is both the mother of technology and its conscience, and the conscience role of science has increased by leaps and bounds in recent years. Science and technology, like almost every other human activity, are mixed blessings, and our ability to separate the good from the bad is inevitably only partial. This is aggravated by the fact that both the good and the bad potential seem to vary more widely from the average as science and technology progress. It is true, of course, today that the world faces a unique situation without precedent in human history. In large part, because of our scientifically generated capacity to grow food and prevent disease, the human population is growing at more than twice the rate ever experienced in the past, absorbing resources that could otherwise be used to generate economic development and a better quality of life for the existing population, and possibly thereby triggering a reduction in human fertility. Present population growth rates must begin to level off within the next 25 years or so. This will happen either through reduced birth rates or through a restoration of the death rate by starvation and disease to what has been the normal expectation throughout most of man's existence on this planet, with the exception of a few places in the past and most of the world in the last 25 years. We live in a world in which interdependence becomes ever more important relative to the independence and self-determination of any human subgroup, such as a nation or tribe. Our capacity to use science to create wealth, though it has raised material standards everywhere, has differentially benefited those whose ancestors first hit upon the scientific method of knowing, the most potent cultural change that man has ever experienced. This, plus related differential rates of population growth, has resulted in an ever-widening income gap between the rich and the poor countries. By itself, this would not be so dangerous, except that the poor can no longer be kept in ignorance of the good life, or at least what appears to them as the good life as conveyed to them by modern communications and travel. Thus, the application of science has both made possible a gap and also the information flow that tends to make the gap intolerable to those who have not crossed it. The dilemma that we face can best be described by saying that we are confronted with unprecedented problems, but also with unprecedented tools with which to solve them. Both the problems and the tools derive from the application and diffusion of science and technology, and we have no way of knowing today whether the problems or the tools will prove more potent. Indeed, even the recognition and subsequent definition of the problems are dependent on the knowledge and insights derived from science and upon our ability to integrate information and data about human activity and the environment on a worldwide basis. Unfortunately, as the power of our tools increases, it becomes more apparent that it is an ambivalent power with ever greater potential for both good and evil. We seem to be traversing an ever narrower ridge towards the peak of a better life, but with a precipice of disaster ever closer on either side of us. The question is whether we will continue toward the mountaintop or whether we will stumble off the precipice as a result of some apparently minor misstep. The range of human choice widens at the same time that the possible price of error escalates. There is one school of pessimism that presents the world's dilemma as primarily material and technical. In this view, we are running out of finite natural resources and irretrievably befouling the life support systems we will need to sustain us in the future. This is the blueprint for survival school that I referred to earlier. In order to avoid disaster, we must drastically curtail our material aspirations and develop immediately a way of sharing the world's natural resources in an equitable manner at a drastically curtailed level of material consumption. The real pessimists, like Robert Heilbrunner, in fact, go on to say that since we can never summon the political will to share resources, the civilized world is doomed to perish in a thermonuclear conflagration brought on by the competition for finite resources. In this view of the world, we are in a zero-sum game, and the problem is how to share essentially fixed wealth and income on a basis acceptable to all capable of registering their aspirations in the international political system. There are also variants of this gloomy outlook. For example, there is the lifeboat ethic attributed to Garrett Hardin, who suggests that to preserve the ecosystem, some of humanity must be allowed to starve in order that the rest may survive. During the world food crisis of 1973, a few experts were talking of triage, allowing the hopeless cases, in this instance the desperately poor fourth world with the most rapid population growth and few indigenous resources, to die, and concentrating our food and other aid on those for whom there was some hope of improvement. Another interesting group that has emerged is the advocates of negative population growth, actually the successor of the zero population growth movement of a few years ago. They would like to see the world population reduced to the point where the world's resources and ecosystems can sustain an adequate standard of living for all. All these variants of pessimism share the perspective of a rigidly finite world, and discussion centers on how to divide this unexpandable pie. There is, however, another point of view that comes somewhat closer to my own. It is that the resource base is constantly shifting and expanding with increasing knowledge and the evolution of technology, and that our problem is not how to divide a fixed pie, but how to withhold enough money from current consumption and direct it in the most efficient way towards expanding our resource base by learning how to extract less accessible or more dilute resources, by substituting abundant for scarce raw materials, and by deriving the same level of material amenity from less resources through more efficient modes of consumption. As one example, Dr. Robert Ayers has made a rather careful analysis of energy use in the United States economy during 1971. From it, he concludes that from a strictly technological viewpoint, that is to say, ignoring political and institutional barriers, we could provide exactly the present mix of final consumption services, that is, personal mobility, dwelling comfort, recreation, and household amenities, with a use of well under 2% of the input energy we actually used in 1971. Ayers considers his estimate conservative in that it takes very little credit for technological innovation, only straightforward application of known technological principles. This is put forward not as a policy, but only to illustrate the fact that the theoretically possible technical scope for more efficient use of one particular resource, namely energy, with essentially no change in the real level of material amenity. That is to say, no real change in lifestyle. As another example, most of the commonly used metals form an important fraction of the Earth's crust. Iron and aluminum are particular examples. Iron ores we now exploit have a concentration only 6 times that of the average in the Earth's crust. Bauxite, the ore of aluminum, is only about 4 times richer than common clays. Magnesium, a possible substitute for aluminum, is infinitely abundant, in effect, in seawater. There's enough uranium in the world's oceans alone to run breeder reactors at current world energy consumption levels for 600,000 years. All indeed, there is enough uranium above ground already from the tails of the enrichment process used to make weapons to be equivalent to our entire coal reserve. All of this requires an indefinitely sustainable source of energy and possibly a level of investment much higher than we now devote to materials extraction. If it becomes necessary and the price is right, the technology can be developed to recycle most of the metals we commonly use. And incidentally, recycling is usually from 5 to 10 times less energy intensive than virgin extraction. In addition, what can be said about efficiency in energy use can also undoubtedly be said about efficiency in the use of other materials. Most of the valuable alloying metals used in much smaller quantities than iron are recoverable from seabed deposits, which constitute a vastly greater resource base than the most accessible and richer land deposits we exploit now. This, too, requires anticipation, investment, and energy. In a sense, no resource, even the absorptive capacity of the environment, which is also in a sense a resource, is truly used up. It can always be recovered or restored at some price, though this price could and might exceed what some part of the world's inhabitants could afford to pay. In this sense, resources are not finite and the pie is expandable, although given sufficient time, technical wisdom, and the willingness to defer current consumption to ensure future supply. In this matter of investment, let me remind you that nearly 10% of the world's GNP and more than 25% of its technical talent is currently being invested in military preparations. This is a prime drain on resources which could be being invested in future productivity. It is a prime example of where the pressure for short-term unilateral advantage of subgroups of humanity wins out over a clear long-term collective benefit to all. This military expenditure, plus the claims on current output generated by population growth in the underdeveloped countries, and perhaps to some extent by escalating material expectations in the developed countries, are the real bottlenecks which becloud our future. Clearly, the world will eventually reach a point where the investment necessary just to keep material consumption constant with a clean environment will consume any further growth in GNP. This will occur earlier and at a lower per capita consumption level, the larger the rate of population growth and the more we fail to defer current consumption for future benefit. But in the view I have outlined, the world is not a zero-sum game in which one person's gain is another's loss. On the contrary, the mutual gain achievable through cooperative effort outweighs the unilateral advantage that can be gained by any subgroup acting purely in its own particularistic interest. Thus, the more we avail ourselves of the potential of science and technology, the more we should find ourselves in a positive-sum game. That is to say, a game in which all players gain by making mutual concessions. The real catch is that the gains from mutuality tend to be much longer term than the gains possible through striving for a unilateral advantage. Both investment in future productivity and cooperative effort share the characteristic of demanding the sacrifice of some current satisfaction for future benefit, that once much maligned middle-class virtue of deferred gratification. In a world of widely differing consumption levels, there is an inevitable battle over whose gratification is to be deferred. One of the issues involved, for example, is the extent to which investment resources should come from the relatively affluent in the less developed countries as compared with the poorer parts of the population in the industrialized countries. The new economic order put forward by the less developed countries calls for raising the price of raw materials imported by the developed countries and opening up developed country markets to imports of finished goods and processed raw materials from the LDCs. Both of these measures are ones which would adversely affect the less affluent in the developed countries and may benefit primarily capitalists and entrepreneurs in the less developed countries. So this is a problem. It is interesting to note that with a few exceptions, only the communist societies, China and Russia, have been able to resist consumption demands sufficiently to put a large share of their resources into investment. But this investment has so far largely gone into producing more investment goods or military hardware, with only slow growth in consumer goods and agriculture. For example, the growth of producer goods output in China, particularly machine tools, has increased at an average rate of 20% a year, compared with 6% a year for consumer goods and only 2% a year for agricultural products. The centrally planned economies have been also rather inefficient in both their allocation and utilization of investment resources. On the other hand, the capitalist welfare states use their investments much more efficiently, but find it difficult to defer consumption sufficiently to provide for their future. And this is equally true in most of the non-communist developing world, though more for the reason of rapid population growth than of rising expectations. The investment necessary to provide for the future must also be such as to embody a high degree of technological progress, and probably one somewhat more focused on critical future bottlenecks such as energy, environment, and materials than has been true in the recent past. Furthermore, the realization of this relatively optimistic model for the future depends on several other conditions which will not necessarily be realized. This is why I say that salvation is just possible, not inevitable. These other conditions are, first, the realization of an indefinitely sustainable energy supply. This could be based either on renewable resources derived from solar energy, on the breeder reactor in some variant, or possibly on fusion, or most likely on some mix of all of these. Secondly, the continuation of a world trading system that makes possible the efficient use of the entire world resource base for the benefit of all. Third, the leveling off of population growth within about 50 years. And fourth, the continuation of a system for generating technological progress and embodying it in capital investment in durable goods, which generates more product and final consumer services for a given resource input. So the overriding problem of the next half century or so is the effectuation of a transition to an indefinitely sustainable energy economy plus a steady state population. At present, only one long-term energy source is well developed, the fission breeder, and its social acceptability is in doubt. The other is social energy, probably in a mix of several technologies. Did I say social energy? I meant to say solar energy. It looks feasible and environmentally benign, but is not well enough developed to be truly assessed. Its investment costs would certainly be very high. Because of the problem of the effect of carbon dioxide on climate, the world will almost certainly have to wean itself away from fossil fuels before our abundant coal supplies are exhausted, unless we can find a way of disposing of the carbon dioxide in the deep oceans. Thus, the transition to permanent energy sources may have to occur sooner than would be dictated by fossil fuel reserves alone. Fusion is another option, but is too speculative to be counted on at the present time. In addition, neither the breeder nor solar energy and their present technological embodiments can really cope with the problem of transportable fuels needed for transportation and for decentralized use in industry. However, this is surely a solvable technical problem given sufficient time. Only the question of cost is in doubt. My principal concern is that at the present time, too much of our research and development effort is going into electric power generation, which is only 10% of final energy demand, and too little into ways of making transportable fuels from renewable resources or from nuclear energy. I would also emphasize that it is not necessary to design the future now in every detail. We need to recognize not only the factor of unpleasant surprises discovered after the deployment of new technology, but also the unpredictable factor of human creativity, which tends to be neglected nowadays. Which will help in offsetting these inevitable problems. The point has been eloquently argued in a famous article by Albert Hirschman, written more than 10 years ago under the title The Principle of the Hiding Hand, by analogy with the invisible hand of Adam Smith. The hiding hand is precisely the ability of human ingenuity to respond to new challenges and new problems. the achievement of all this does depend on the assumption of an ultimate leveling off of population growth. There is a clear trade-off between the ultimate world population and the average per capita income, which is indefinitely sustainable in the sense of equilibrium between investment and consumption that I mentioned earlier. That this can happen does not mean that it will happen. What I am really saying is that a sustainable and equitable human future is possible without leveling downward, provided population does not get out of hand. It is a possibility which is not constrained by technical and resource considerations, but it should be quite clear that rapid advance of science and technology is a necessary precondition, though by no means a sufficient one. The big question being raised by the critics of a technological future is whether the kind of social world created is compatible with safe and effective democratic management of a highly technological society. More and more the critics are, for example, of nuclear power are shifting from criticisms of the technical characteristics to the capacity of the human institutions to manage this technology safely and responsibly, as I mentioned earlier. They are attacking the credibility of regulatory institutions and arguing that adequate engineering plans and safeguards will inevitably founder on faulty and corrupt implementation. These critics also point to the rising tide of crime and terrorism that seems to characterize all industrial societies in the world of today. And they suggest that this is a byproduct of the alienation induced by the complexity and impersonality of the institutions, which they say necessarily characterize a technological society. They go on to say that the existence of such alienated individuals and groups is incompatible with the vulnerabilities that characterize the complexity and interdependence of modern society. In other words, do technological societies produce social conditions which breed the seeds of their own disintegration? At the same time, the measures needed to suppress crime and terrorism seem incompatible with the democratic values and civil liberties which make material affluence worthwhile. I think these questions are unanswerable at the present time. A very similar point is made from another perspective by those who accept the desirability of technology but are frustrated by our inability to get on with it. We have greatly increased the expectations of the individual, not only for material well-being, but also with respect to his influence on and participation in social decisions which potentially affect his welfare. Thus, society has to accommodate to an increasing variety of individual and group interests, while also having to exhibit greater logical coherence and consistency in its decisions because of their increasingly wide systemic effects. Fragmented and personalized interests and values are difficult to blend with rational planning. A large power grid requires a degree of rational, centralized planning, which is hard to reconcile with satisfying all the variety of conflicting interests which are affected. As a result, we find that the requirements for democratic participation are in collision with the requirements of internal consistency in the social management of technology. More and more people expect to eat their cake and have it too, and few of the actors have much incentive to consider the larger context of a decision in their desire to ensure that their particular interests or values are fully protected in the outcome. As a result, we seem to be experiencing currently a paralysis of decision-making and an escalation of the transaction costs, as they're called, of even the simplest public decisions. This is nowhere more apparent than in the case of energy. Whether this is a temporary phenomenon representing the early stages of a new social learning process, which I tend to suspect it is, or whether it is a permanent and growing disability of industrial democracies, it is probably too early to say. But it could represent the greatest single obstacle to realization of the potential of science and technology to provide viable solutions to the grave problems we face. In a nutshell, the urgency of the problems that face us may require a wide social consensus in order to proceed in a sustained way towards their solution. There probably are, in fact, several nearly equally viable routes to a solution, but I doubt if they will work or can be pursued simultaneously. They contain mutually incompatible elements. Yet our own material prosperity and the magnetic attraction it exerts on the rest of the world seems to make achievement of the necessary consensus more and more difficult. This is so precisely because we are not in the sort of crisis we're used to in wartime or as a result of external challenge. Thus, the more I study these problems, the more apparent it becomes that the barriers to their solution are institutional and political rather than technical. When a crisis of some sort creates a temporary consensus dominated by one readily identified social goal, we seem to be able to work wonders with science and technology. The last dramatic example was the decade of national commitment to a moon landing following the Russian Sputnik. But the serious problems like energy, food, and world poverty are not crises, and they impinge on too many varied interests and competitive values to be susceptible of the single-minded treatment accorded for a time to space exploration. Thus, the problems that confront us fail to attract sustained political attention, despite transient alarm signals and much passionate rhetoric by a few people. They do not seem to be able to command a lasting public consensus on a logically consistent set of policies and priorities. The nature of the problems is beyond the imagination and visualization of most people. There's no simple slogan about which we can rally for long. Project Independence hardly outlasted a year. The world food crisis hardly outlasted the 1973 grain shortfall and the Russian wheat deal. The environmental crisis gave ground before the energy crisis. The Northeast water crisis of the 1960s, which everybody has now forgotten, dissolved in a decade of abundant rainfall. The population explosion is a creeping catastrophe which is remote and slow-acting, and over which the average American feels he can have little leverage. Despite all this frustration, I remain an optimist, possibly only because of my training as a scientist in the generation in which I grew up. I believe that science and technology can place solutions to our problems within our grasp, and I find it difficult to believe that the frailty of human institutions in the last analysis will ultimately deny us the realization of the opportunities which lie within our technical capabilities. So I end with the proposition that science is still more destiny than doom, but I also have to admit that it is much more nip and tuck than I would have said 10 years ago. Thank you. I would be.
Professor Brooks has indicated that he would be glad to answer any questions, so if you have some, feel free to ask.
The fact that we are reporting almost half of our oil being used gives me a definite source of worry. I suppose it is you too. What do you see as a solution to that problem? I don't think there's any short-term solution. I think, and I don't think the solution will come from any one source. I think it's got to come from a combination of much more vigorous attention to conservation, plus development of coal resources, some expansion of nuclear, and some work in the direction of other energy sources, although they probably can't make a major contribution for another 20 or 30 years. But I think substantial progress can be made in the next 10 or 15 years, but we certainly have lost almost completely the last 2 or 3 years. And of course, as long as we're importing such a large fraction of our oil, we're extremely vulnerable. I guess the only thing in my mind that mitigates that vulnerability is the fact that Europe and Japan are so much more vulnerable that even if we were completely energy self-sufficient, unless we also had sufficient energy to supply our allies, we would not be very much better off even if Project Independence had succeeded. And in fact, the successful achievement of Project Independence would have, I think, greatly aroused the political apprehensions of our allies. Yes?
What prospects do you see for international political maturity so that problems like the arms race and the OPEC oil problem would be somewhat raised? We'd have resources to instead of on arms, but on materials development. We wouldn't have to worry about an oil crisis created by political action. When is that going to happen?
You tell me. I think one has to recognize that it's a very slow process and that it won't happen overnight. And I think we have to keep working on it very hard without getting too discouraged. I was very distressed in a way to detect that the president was so extremely disappointed over the results of the Moscow visit of Secretary Vance, because I think the history indicates that every new administration in the United States has been stonewalled by the Russians, and we should have simply assumed that would be the case and paid no attention. Yet apparently the president appears to have been very surprised by what happened. I don't believe at all it means, unless we lose our heads, I don't believe at all that it means we can't make a much better deal with the Russians than Vladivostok, but it's going to take time. And I think that is the first step towards solving some of the other problems.
You referred in the last part of your talk to, I believe the term you used, social management of technology.
Yeah.
Is that correct? Now, as you and I know, technologists are quick to mention that the government does not own technology, except for the nuclear technology. Could you elaborate on what you feel is the framework for such management of technology?
Well, by social management of technology, I really refer to the whole host of mechanisms, both private and public, by which we control the way technology is deployed, ranging all the way from government regulation and government investment in R&D to the marketing of goods and services and private investment in new technology. In other words, it's you might say the complete social supporting system, supporting and regulation system for technology. What?
You're mentioning the tools. What sort of objectives and what you try to accomplish? What framework did you try to do that?
Well, I think that's precisely the problem. That is, without, in fact, some more consensus on what our objectives are, I think it's very difficult to get on. It's very difficult to get on with a job, and I think that's nowhere better illustrated in the case of energy. And the reason is, of course, that there are so many conflicting goals. You can't raise prices without raising problems of regional and income group equity, and yet I see no way that you could really have much of an effect on consumption without some rise in prices. Something has got to equilibrate supply and demand, and I think while rationing might be used for a short time, I find it totally incredible that the American public would accept rationing in times, except in conditions of real crisis, except as a very temporary measure. So in the long run, energy consumption has got to be brought down and production brought up by equilibration, by the law of supply and demand. And the problem is how to adjust to a new price structure without too much social disruption and too much equity blow, regional and other kinds of equity. And that's why it's been so slow in really making any progress. In addition to that, of course, the lack of decision in the government has had the effect of discouraging any private investment. And this is a real problem. One can't be too critical, because what one is really advocating, in a sense, is accepting a price structure which is in many ways very artificial. That is, it's the price structure set by the OPEC countries. However, I think more and more economists are coming to believe that in fact the OPEC price structure may not be so far from economic rationality as used to be thought, because while it's true that the production costs of Middle Eastern oil are tiny compared with what we have to pay for oil, even after you take into account transportation costs, the scarcity value of oil, given the fact that world production will probably peak around 1995, is probably already sufficient to raise the price considerably above production costs. But that is part of the problem.
But now you're caught in the following dilemma. To readjust the price of, say, oil, you're on the one hand destroying the value of some of the fixed investment in the Western economies, but at the same time, for your blueprint to work, you have to stimulate a much higher rate of investment than we've observed.
Well, that's why you can't. Yeah, that's why you can't do it. You can't do it overnight. You see, the big difficulty, and the reason we're in such difficulty today on energy, and it's not only really OPEC and all that, it's also due to the policy that was followed on natural gas for 15 years. You've got the problem that you've got a huge fixed investment that is predicated on a certain price structure for fuels, and in some senses a totally irrational price structure in which the cost per million BTU of the cleanest and most convenient fuel was the lowest cost of any fuel. I mean, the most valuable fuel had the lowest price, and the least valuable fuel, in fact, coal, probably had the highest price. So you have an almost absurd price structure, and but of course it's very difficult to change that when you have so much fixed investment, not only industrial investment but also consumer investment, and so on, and that's really the dilemma. I think the problem is only going to be solved. I guess my own view tends to incline towards letting the price go as quickly as possible to a more rational price structure, but doing a great deal of compensation in the economy of those who are hurt, and including decompensation of those who enjoy windfall profits. In other words, whenever you make a very quick adjustment in the price structure, some people are going to have a bonanza and other people are going to have a catastrophe, and I think you're never going to be able to make this adjustment without some form of compensation. And yet, the longer we delay such adjustment, the bigger the trauma is going to be when it finally inevitably comes. Yeah.
If I understood you correctly, everything you said, particularly your optimism, is predicated on the assumption that population growth, world population growth, will stabilize. But you didn't address yourself to the technology of that.
Yeah. No, I think there's some reason to hope. I didn't say that very much on that because there are other people that are more expert than I am, and I know there's a great deal of variation among the experts, but there are at least 12 or 13 countries, most of them small, underdeveloped countries, some with very low income, like Sri Lanka, that have made very substantial progress in reducing birth rate. And so I think there is some optimism among the population experts that the demographic transition, we may be on the verge of a real beginning to the demographic transition. But it's too early really to say. I think the biggest question mark right now, and the most exciting development, and the one that we really don't know the answer to, is what's happening in China. If the Chinese have really succeeded in reducing their population growth as much as the most optimistic people have have suggested, then I think that presents a real hope for the world. The other place that's interesting and suggests an interesting analogy with China is Sri Lanka, which has a much more comprehensive social welfare system than any of the other underdeveloped countries, and is also a much higher status of women, and is also the country that has experienced one of the most dramatic turnarounds in population growth. The other variable that seems to be important is income equality, and countries such as South Korea and Taiwan, where rapid development has been accompanied by increasing income equality, also seem to have experienced a considerable reduction in fertility rates, whereas other countries which have enjoyed equal economic growth but accompanied by widening income gaps, such as Brazil, have had the other effect. So I think there is a general belief among population people, as I understand it, that income equality may be an important variable in influencing fertility rates. You asked about the technology. I think certainly new technology is important because it reduces it makes it easier or reduces the costs of decisions to reduce fertility. But I think the basic variable that keeps family size large is social rather than technological.
How has it been done in Sri Lanka?
All they know is that the families are smaller. I don't think anybody really knows exactly why. I mean, there's plenty of historical, we have plenty of historical data to indicate that under certain circumstances, countries reduce their population growth without any new technology. The Irish behavior after the potato famine is one of the classic examples, and during the 19th or the 18th century, I guess it was, in Eastern Europe, Hungary and some of those countries, you actually had negative population growth for a while due to social conditions. So that I don't think that population growth can be treated as though it were a purely biological phenomenon, though I don't want to suggest that it's, the biology isn't involved. But I think I don't think it necessarily follows that even if a very much better technology were available for family planning, it alone would have that much influence on fertility. Obviously, you have to have both.
What level would you assess the probabilities of thermonuclear war?
Pardon?
Probabilities of thermonuclear war.
I think that's almost impossible really to assess. I think there are very strong inhibitions, obviously, against it, and I think if thermonuclear war occurs, it'll be through miscalculation, not through any deliberate or conscious choice. It'll come in some kind of a roaring crisis, like the Cuban Missile Crisis.
You say that any war will be a thermonuclear war?
Not necessarily.
I think there's a possibility of major war without.
Well, it depends what you call a major war. I think it's very unlikely that you could have a major, let's say, a Soviet invasion of Western Europe without leading to nuclear war. But I think the Russians are very well aware of that fact. And if you got a thermonuclear war from that situation, I think it's likely to be some kind of a bluff calling type of operation. No, I don't know what it's very hard to say what the probability is. I just don't know how to assess it. What's that?
I'm extremely pessimistic.
Yeah. Yes?
Thermal reactors, you suggest that we ought to build them as rapidly as we need them, irrespective of the fact that we don't know what to do with the waste at this time?
No, I wouldn't say that, and I would take exception to a little bit to the statement that we don't know what to do with the waste. I think the problem with waste, I put it this way: we know what to do with the waste, but we can't prove with a high enough level of confidence that it'll work for the length of time necessary. There may be at least 3 or 4 or 5 apparently perfectly acceptable ways of dealing with the waste, acceptable in the sense that if everything goes according to calculation, there is no danger. But the problem is, when you're trying to do something that's got to last as long as that, is a real problem as to how do you prove in 5 years that something's going to last 1,000,000 years. That's with a high enough level, with a level of confidence, at a high enough level of confidence. That's really the problem. It isn't how to find a way of storing the waste. It's how to prove that whichever way you choose is really safe enough with a high enough level of confidence. Now you can say, well, that's how to find a way, but it's a little different meaning. It doesn't mean you have to. It won't do any good to keep scrabbling around thinking of new ways. It's much more a question of how do you prove that the ways we already have are good enough. But it's not accurate to say we don't know what to do with the waste. Of course, the whole situation has been greatly aggravated by the fact that the wastes have been so badly managed in the past. The military wastes have been so badly managed because, in fact, we started out simply not worrying about what to do with the wastes, and so we just did any old thing with them for about 20 years. And so the problem with the wastes actually is, the biggest problem with the waste is how to manage the waste we've already got. The addition of new reactors would be a tiny addition to the problem. And that isn't to say that you necessarily want to make that addition, but already the volume, not the radioactivity, but the volume of military waste is much greater than the volume of waste that we'll have from nuclear reactors for the next 25 years.
So would you go ahead and build additional nuclear reactors in the country?
Yes, I would. I wouldn't go all out just for that reason, but I think I wouldn't put a complete ban on the construction of new reactors just because of the waste problem.
Did I understand you to say that Robert Ayers said that we could deliver the same services with 2%?
Yes.
Do you think that's realistic?
Well, now that's not a policy, you understand, it's just simply a technical calculation. To do that would probably require the use of other resources that would be astronomical and very uneconomic. But let me just give you one specific example. Suppose that you said that what you wanted to deliver was your living room at 70 degrees Fahrenheit. You define that as a consumer service. You don't care how you get your living room at 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So when you say you consume energy, that's not what you're doing. You're consuming a living room at 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And any way you can get it there is an equally good way of doing it. It's only a question of cost. Well, suppose that you had a fuel cell operating a heat pump. It turns out just with that calculation alone, using the theoretical efficiency of a fuel cell and the practical efficiency of a heat pump, you could heat, and then very good insulation and plugging all the leaks and so on, you could keep your living room at 70 degrees Fahrenheit for about 4% of the energy it takes you now. Now, if you do a few other things, like maybe putting some radiant heat in the walls and so on, so that you don't have to keep the air as warm, but it still feels like 70 degrees Fahrenheit, you can probably get by with even less energy. And you can go through a lot of things. Now, but that's not, you see, that would be terribly expensive. That is, the cost to keep your living room at that temperature would be very much higher. That's why I emphasize the fact that it's a purely technical calculation. And I only
bring it forward to suggest not that that's something you can or should do, but to suggest that the technical potential is there if the cost structure changed enough for using very, very much less energy than we do now. And if energy became more valuable, and more valuable relative to the other materials and labor and so on that goes into changing the capital for consuming energy, then in fact the capital structure would be changed so that you'd use less energy. I mean, after all, in the last 200 years, technological change has produced a situation in which a man-hour of labor produces about 20 times as much as it did 200 years ago. There's no reason to believe that if energy becomes very scarce, technological change won't take place in such a way that a kilowatt hour of energy will produce 20 times as much output as it does today. I mean, it all really depends on what's valuable and what isn't valuable. So I guess I'll have to admit to my economic colleagues, because really all in the last analysis depends on economics. Yeah.
You indicated that you would like to see a greater emphasis placed upon transportable energy and increased research in this area. Would you recommend, and would you recommend that this be done at the expense of research in the electrical power area?
Well, I haven't really completely made up my mind about that. I guess I'm inclined to feel that this statement applies particularly to solar energy. That is, I think the emphasis in the solar, if you look at the solar R&D program, which is now about a quarter of the nuclear program in size.